Asteroids is a classic arcade game developed by Atari and released in 1979. Created by Lyle Rains and Ed Logg, the game became one of the most iconic titles of the golden age of arcades. The simplicity of the gameplay and engaging design contributed to its enduring success. The player controls a small spaceship in open space filled with asteroids and space objects. Destroy asteroids without being hit by them or other space hazards. Players earn points by destroying asteroids and, in later stages, also enemies. The ship can rotate both clockwise and counterclockwise. Fires projectiles to destroy asteroids and enemies. Asteroids break into smaller pieces when hit. Smaller fragments can be destroyed for additional points. In addition to asteroids, players must contend with enemies called UFOs that appear periodically and shoot at the player's ship. The game screen is a single display without transitions. Asteroids leaving one side reappear on the other. As the player progresses, the game speed increases, and the number of asteroids and enemies rises, making the challenge progressively harder. Asteroids had a significant impact on video game culture, helping to establish shooters and arcades as a popular form of entertainment. Due to its initial success, numerous versions and adaptations of the game were created for various platforms, including home computers and game consoles. In summary, Asteroids is a classic arcade game that has made its mark in the history of video games. Its simplicity, combined with engaging gameplay and an ever-increasing challenge, has endeared it to generations of players. Cosmo is an arcade video game produced by TDS and Mintz in 1979. The game is a vertically scrolling shooter where the player controls a spaceship that must destroy approaching alien ships. Developed for the Z80 arcade hardware, Cosmo was one of the first arcade games to feature a space setting. The player navigates a spaceship tasked with destroying approaching alien ships. The game was well received by both critics and players, becoming one of the most successful arcade games of its time. Crash is an arcade video game produced by Excitey in 1979. The game is a two-dimensional maze racing game where the player controls a car moving through the maze to collect points while simultaneously avoiding enemy cars attempting to collide with the player. Developed by Edward Valo at Excitey, the game achieved significant success among players of that era. Dai 3 Wakusei is a vertical arcade shooter game released in September 1979 in Japan. The player controls a spaceship that can move in all directions through a barricade and must destroy waves of enemies that descend from the top of the screen. The gameplay is similar to Space Invaders 1. The game is considered a precursor to Centipede. The gameplay of the arcade game Dodgem from 1979 involves the player controlling a car that erases dots by running over them while avoiding a head-on collision with another car. The game is a maze game, and the objective is to clear the dots as quickly as possible while avoiding the other car. Dodgem was produced by Zaccaria in 1979, and it was also released for the Bally Astrocade in 1978. Head-On is an arcade game produced by Sega/Gremlin in 1979. The game was the first maze game in which the objective was to collect points. The game was designed by Lane Hawk at Sega/Gremlin in the United States and was the fourth highest grossing arcade game of 1979 in both Japan and the United States. Galaxia is a science fiction arcade game produced by Zaccaria in 1979. The game is a variant of Galician, in which the player controls a spaceship at the bottom of the screen and enemy fighters arrive from above in formation and with different types of behaviors. The player must avoid their projectiles and suicide attacks. What distinguishes the game from Galician is that it copies the energy mechanic from Astro Wars, meaning the player cannot waste his shots. The Invaders is an arcade game produced by Zaccaria in 1979. The game was developed as a variant of Space Invaders, in which the player controls a tank that moves back and forth at the bottom of the screen and must shoot waves of aliens advancing towards Earth. The game has been made available in several versions, including a version for MAME. Deep Scan is an arcade game produced by Zaccaria in 1979. However, Deep Scan was developed by Sega and published by Gremlin. The game was released as a variant of Depth Charge, in which the player controls a warship on the surface of the ocean trying to destroy submarines below. Most of the screen is a side view of the water with enemy submarines patrolling within it. The objective is to destroy as many submarines as possible by dropping explosives from the left or right of the ship, while avoiding the mines dropped by these submarines. Invinco/Head-On 2-Inch is a 1979 arcade game produced by Sega. The game belongs to the Dual series of arcade cabinets, which offered players the ability to play 2 games in one. Invinco is an air combat game in which the player controls a plane that must shoot down other enemy planes. Head-On 2 is a driving game in which the player controls a car that must collect points while avoiding colliding with other cars. Sega VIC Duel. IPM Invader is a 1979 arcade video game developed and published by IPM. The game is a copy of Space Invaders Part 2, with 5 rows of colorful invaders appearing on the screen and needing to be eliminated by pressing the attack button. The points for killing them vary depending on the row the alien is in. At the same time, you have to move your ship left or right to avoid alien fire. You can hide behind one of the 4 barriers at the bottom of the screen if you want cover. Every third level, a coffee break called Coffee Break appears. A coffee cup is drawn on the screen, and is filled with 2 rows of Space Invaders. This allows players to rest from the monotonous and repetitive onslaught of waves of invaders. When the game's dip switches are set to advanced settings, the game becomes more difficult. With the exception of the first wave, the passing UFO releases capsules along the top row, thus defeating the player's narrow column strategy. The game has separate horizontal and vertical outputs, called dual sync, and these outputs have been converted to horizontal composite negative sync because they don't work on most monitors. Rotary Fighter is a 1979 arcade video game developed and published by Kansai Seiki Seisakusho. The game is a variant of Space Invaders, in which the player controls a tank that moves horizontally at the bottom of the screen and must destroy enemies that fall from above. Enemies descend slowly and the player can hide behind bunkers. Every now and then a UFO flies overhead, which can be shot down for bonus points. Space Fever High Splitter is a 1979 arcade video game developed and published by Nintendo. The game is a variant of Space Invaders, with slightly different gameplay mechanics. In this game, the player must shoot enemies that fall from above, but if you don't hit the alien in the center, it will split it in 2, both of which will have to be shot down. The game has 5 difficulty levels and mono audio output. Shuttle Invader is a Space Invaders variant. The player controls a tank at the bottom of the screen and fires straight up towards a formation of incoming invaders. For bunkers provide cover, but they will take damage from incoming hits. A periodic UFO that flies by can be hit for bonus points. Space King 2 is a fixed shooter developed and released by Konami in 1979 for the arcade platforms. The game, like its predecessor Space King, is often considered as a clone of Space Invaders. Starfire 2 is a first-person arcade coin-operated space combat video game created by Excitey in 1979. It is considered a groundbreaking shoot-'em-up arcade game that brought several new innovations to the market. The game was distributed in Japan by Taito and Esco Trading. It was the first arcade video game to use an enclosed sit-down cockpit cabinet, allow a player to enter their initials on the high score table, and be built on a reprogrammable microprocessor-based game system with full-color graphics. The game is a space combat simulation that allows single-player mode. It was followed by an updated version, Starfire 2, with fixes. The game was later ported to the Atari 8-bit and Commodore 64 computers. The look and feel of the game were directly inspired by the movie Star Wars, although the game was not officially licensed to use the Star Wars trademarks. The game is brightly colored, in blues, greens, and reds. It was one of the first games to allow the player to partially damage an enemy with a glancing shot. The game can be run on a PC by the Multiple Arcade Machine emulator, MAME. Overall, Starfire 2 is considered a significant game in the history of arcade gaming, introducing several innovations and being a precursor to many later space combat games. Tunnel Hunt is an arcade video game released by Atari in 1979. It is a first-person shooter game that takes place in underground tunnels, in which the player pilots a spaceship and fights enemy ships. The game was initially called Tube Chase and was later renamed Tunnel Hunt when it was published by Century in 1982. The game was designed and programmed by Owen Rubin. It used an MOS Technology M6502 processor and two Poki sound chips. The game was initially inspired by the landing sequence from the movie Alien. However, the game was not deemed entertaining enough by Atari and was sold to Excitey as Vertigo, later being sold to Century as Tunnel Hunt. The game was released in Japan on June 22, 1979. Warp 1 is an arcade game released by Sun Electronics in 1979. It is a first-person space shooter game where the player pilots a spacecraft and engages in combat. The game is a crosshair-based shooter with an into-the-screen starfield. It was one of the early games to use this perspective. The game is relatively rare, and it can be played on a PC using the Multiple Arcade Machine emulator, MAME. Yasaku to Donbei is an arcade video game released by Wing Company, Limited in 1979. The game is a first-person shooter where the player controls a farmer who shoots crows from a tree, while a woodcutter cuts the tree section by section. The game was inspired by Space Invaders and features a similar gameplay. The player must avoid falling pine cones and shoot 37 crows, as well as a large crow flying across the top of the screen. For every 1,000 points scored, the player gains an extra life. When all lives are used up, the game ends. The game was only released in Japan and is not well known outside of the country. The game Ripcord was developed by Excitey Incorporated and was released in 1979 for the arcade platform. The game requires the player to coordinate an acrobat to pull out a parachute and bank towards one of the landing spots, while avoiding flying helicopters and trying not to land in water. If you hit a helicopter, the player falls and the game ends. The game is over when a limited number of jumps is used. The game was designed and programmed by Arlen Granger.